"Ma'am, you need to sit down now." The voice cut through the courtroom like cold air slipping under a locked door, sharp but controlled, the kind of authority people didn't question because they were used to it sounding that way. And for a moment, no one moved. Not even the woman standing near the front row, her posture straight but unassuming, her coat simple, her hands resting loosely at her sides as if she had all the time in the world, while around her, papers shifted, chairs creaked softly, and the faint hum of overhead lights filled the silence that followed, a silence that didn't feel neutral, more like something waiting to tip in one direction or the other. And Officer Daniel Hayes stepped closer, his polished shoes tapping once against the tile, his presence firm, practiced, the kind built over years of being obeyed without hesitation, his uniform pressed clean, badge catching the fluorescent light in brief flashes as he looked down at her like he had already decided who she was, already placed her somewhere beneath him in the invisible order he carried in his head. And when she didn't immediately sit, didn't rush to comply the way most people did under that tone, something in his jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for anyone to call it anger, but enough to shift the air again, and he reached out. Not rough, not dramatic, just a controlled, corrective motion meant to guide her back into place. The kind of touch he'd used countless times before, the kind that said more about assumption than intention, and the room reacted in small ways. A clerk pausing mid-typing, a man in the second row lowering his gaze, someone near the back whispering too quietly to make out. Because moments like this didn't explode, they folded inward, subtle, almost ordinary, except they weren't. Not really. Not when the woman he was correcting didn't flinch, didn't pull away, didn't even shift her weight. She just looked at him, calm, steady, her eyes clear in a way that didn't match the role everyone had already assigned to her. And for a fraction of a second, it created a flicker of something unfamiliar in the space between them, something Daniel didn't name because he didn't need to. Not when he had control of the situation, not when everything around him reinforced that control, the judge's bench still empty, the routine of the courtroom still intact, the expectation that order meant compliance, and compliance meant silence. And yet her silence didn't feel like submission. It felt like something else, something quieter but heavier, like she was waiting for the room to catch up to something it hadn't realized yet. And Daniel exhaled through his nose, resetting the moment in his favor, his voice lowering just enough to sound measured instead of sharp as he gestured again toward the seat. A small movement, efficient, final, the kind that usually ended things, and around them, people resumed breathing, resumed shifting, resumed pretending this was just another ordinary exchange, because that was easier than questioning it, easier than noticing the details that didn't quite fit, like the way the woman's coat, though simple, was tailored with care, or the way her posture didn't carry the hesitation of someone out of place, or the way her gaze didn't drop even when everything about the room suggested it should. And somewhere near the aisle, a young clerk glanced up again, this time holding the look a fraction longer than before, as if trying to place a face that felt familiar but didn't belong to the context. And Daniel missed that entirely. His focus fixed forward, already moving on, already assuming the moment had resolved itself the way it always did, unaware that the stillness he had just pushed against hadn't broken. It had only settled deeper, waiting, quiet, patient, like something just out of frame. And as the courtroom door at the side creaked open with a slow, deliberate sound, a few heads turned instinctively, not because they knew why, but because something in the air had shifted just enough to make them notice. And Daniel didn't look back. Not yet. Not even as the woman's expression softened in a way that wasn't surrender but recognition, as if the moment he thought he controlled had already begun to move beyond him, and the room held its breath without knowing why, just as the door opened wider. The door did not slam. It did not announce itself with urgency. It opened the way old buildings always did, slow and deliberate, the hinges releasing a soft groan that stretched just long enough to be noticed without interrupting anything. And yet the sound lingered in the edges of the room like a thread someone could not quite pull free, and a few people near the aisle turned their heads instinctively, not because they expected anything important, but because something in the air had shifted just enough to make ordinary feel slightly off. And the woman standing near the front row followed that movement with only her eyes, her posture unchanged, her hands still relaxed at her sides, while Officer Daniel Hayes remained focused forward, his attention already drifting back toward routine, toward control, toward the quiet assumption that the moment he had just handled was finished, resolved, filed away like every other small correction he had made in rooms like this. And the clerk at the side desk paused again, fingers hovering over the keyboard as the person entering came into clearer view, a man in a dark suit, older, composed, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that did not need to be announced, his gaze scanning the room not in curiosity but in recognition, as if he knew exactly where he was and exactly who mattered within it. And when his eyes passed over the woman, something subtle changed, not dramatic, not obvious, just a brief stillness, a fraction of a second where acknowledgement replaced neutrality. And then he continued forward, his steps measured, each one landing with quiet precision on the polished floor, while the room, unaware of its own adjustment, began to settle again, conversations staying low, papers shifting back into place, people returning to the comfort of assumption. And Daniel shifted his weight slightly, one hand resting near his belt, his posture easing just enough to signal that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, his mind already moving ahead to the next instruction, the next task, the next moment where he would be expected to maintain order without question. And behind him, the woman finally moved, not quickly, not reactively, but with a calm intention that did not match the role she had been given, taking a single step toward the aisle, her coat brushing softly against the back of a chair, the fabric catching a sliver of light that revealed its quiet quality, not expensive in an obvious way, but chosen with care. And the faint scent of clean linen followed in her wake, subtle, grounding, something that contrasted with the sharper smells of polished wood and old paper that filled the courtroom. And the older man slowed as she approached, his posture straightening just slightly, not out of tension but respect, the kind that lived in small, almost invisible adjustments. And the clerk noticed it this time, really noticed it, the way his shoulders aligned, the way his gaze settled, and a question flickered across her face before she quickly looked back down at her screen, as if unsure whether she had imagined it. And Daniel, still turned away, missed all of it, the shift in tone, the quiet exchange that had not yet become words. The way the space between people was rearranging itself without any formal announcement, and the woman stopped a few feet from the aisle, not stepping fully into it, not claiming the center of the room, just pausing there, as if she understood timing in a way the rest of them did not, her eyes briefly lowering, then lifting again toward the front, toward the empty judge's bench, toward the space where authority would soon be made visible. And the older man inclined his head slightly, a gesture so small it could have been dismissed as habit, except it was not here, not now. And the clerk's fingers finally touched the keyboard again, but she did not type, her attention caught between what she was supposed to do and what she felt she was beginning to see. And somewhere in the back, a chair shifted louder than necessary, breaking the fragile quiet for just a moment before it settled again. And Daniel turned his head just enough to register the movement, his eyes scanning briefly, assessing, dismissing, his focus returning forward with the same steady confidence he had carried into the room, unaware that the alignment he relied on had already begun to change. And as the woman's gaze lingered on the front of the courtroom, steady and unreadable, the older man came to a stop beside her, close enough to speak, but neither of them said a word yet. And for a brief second, the entire room seemed to hover in that silence, balanced on something no one had named, as if waiting for the first voice that would shift everything. The older man did not rush his words. He leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that it did not travel far, yet steady enough to carry weight where it mattered. And though no one could clearly hear what he said, the effect was immediate in the smallest of ways, a subtle straightening in his posture, a quiet attentiveness that did not belong to casual conversation. And the woman listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, calm in a way that did not ask for permission, her eyes steady as if she had heard everything before it was spoken. And for a brief moment, the world around them continued as if nothing had shifted, a pen scratching softly against paper, a cough muffled into a sleeve, the low hum of the air system pressing down on the edges of the room. And then the clerk looked up again, this time longer, her gaze moving between the two figures near the aisle, something in her memory trying to connect pieces that did not fit the scene she thought she understood, and across the room, Daniel finally turned slightly, not fully, just enough to catch the presence of movement behind him, his eyes scanning over shoulders and faces with practiced efficiency until they landed on the older man, recognition flickering there for a fraction of a second, not personal, but institutional, the kind that came from years of seeing certain people in certain roles, and his posture adjusted almost automatically, a small recalibration of respect that did not extend to the woman beside him. Not yet, not in his mind. And he held that gaze for a moment before looking away again, reassured by what he thought he understood, reassured that whatever was happening did not involve him, did not require him to change anything about how he had just acted, and the woman shifted her weight slightly, just enough to step fully into the aisle now, the movement quiet, deliberate, her shoes making the softest sound against the floor, a sound that somehow drew more attention than anything louder might have, because it was precise, intentional, and the older man took half a step back, not in retreat, but in deference, creating space around her without making it obvious, and that was when the clerk stopped pretending to type altogether, her hands resting still as she watched, her breathing shallow, her instincts telling her something was unfolding that did not match the script she had been following. And near the back, two people exchanged a glance, subtle but questioning, the kind that asked without words whether they were missing something important, and Daniel felt that shift more than he saw it, a slight change in the rhythm of the room, like a conversation that had paused without explanation, and he turned a little more this time, his brow tightening just slightly as his attention returned to the front row, to the woman he had already dismissed, already categorized, and for the first time, something did not align as easily as before, not because she had changed, but because the space around her had, the way people were looking, the way the older man remained just behind her shoulder instead of beside it, the way the air itself seemed to hold a different weight, and the woman did not acknowledge any of that directly. She simply stood there, composed, her gaze forward, her hands still, as if she understood that recognition did not need to be forced, that it arrived in its own time whether people were ready for it or not. And the door behind them remained slightly open, a thin line of hallway light cutting across the floor, stretching toward where she stood, and for a moment, it felt like that line marked something unseen, a quiet boundary between what the room believed and what was about to become undeniable, and the older man finally spoke again, this time just loud enough for a few nearby to catch a word or two, not enough to form a full sentence, but enough to carry tone, and that tone held something different now, something closer to formality, to acknowledgement, to a respect that did not need explanation, and Daniel caught that too, his focus sharpening as he listened without meaning to, his instincts pulling him closer to something he had not yet named, and the clerk's eyes widened just slightly, the pieces in her mind beginning to settle into place, not fully, not clearly, but enough to make her sit up straighter, her attention fixed entirely on the woman in the aisle. And as the room's quiet stretched just a little too long, the kind of silence that comes right before something shifts, the woman took one more step forward, unhurried, unforced, and everything about the moment seemed to narrow toward her, as if the rest of the room was slowly falling out of focus, and Daniel felt it then, not understanding, not realization, just the first hint that something he thought was settled had never been his to control, and he did not know yet why that feeling would not leave him. The air in the courtroom did not move, but it felt heavier, like something unseen had settled over every surface, pressing quietly into shoulders, into breath, into the small spaces between people where assumptions used to sit comfortably, and Angela Brooks stood at the edge of that shift without acknowledging it, her presence neither demanding nor shrinking, simply existing with a steadiness that did not ask to be understood, while the older man beside her remained just half a step behind, his hands loosely at his sides, his gaze forward but attentive, as if waiting for a cue that only he could recognize, and across the room, Daniel Hayes adjusted his stance again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but different this time, less certain, his eyes returning to her not out of authority, but curiosity edged with something he did not yet name, and the clerk swallowed quietly, her throat tightening as the pieces in her mind began to align in ways that made her uneasy, because recognition was not loud. It was a quiet rearranging of what you thought you knew, and she had seen that look before, that slight shift in posture from the older man, that measured distance, that unspoken respect, and it did not belong to ordinary interactions. Not here, not like this. And near the back, someone leaned forward just slightly, elbows on knees, drawn in without realizing it, while another person stopped mid-note, pen hovering above paper as if the next word no longer mattered, and Angela took another step, slow, controlled, her shoes landing softly against the polished floor, the sound clean and deliberate, echoing just enough to mark the movement without interrupting the silence. And she did not look at Daniel as she passed him, not directly, her gaze remaining forward. But something in that choice carried more weight than any confrontation could have, as if she had already moved beyond the moment he thought defined her. And Daniel felt that too, a faint tightening in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of something unfamiliar, like standing on ground that no longer felt entirely solid. And he turned his head just slightly to follow her movement, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place what had shifted, what he had missed, what detail refused to settle into the pattern he expected. And the older man followed her at that same measured distance, never overtaking, never falling behind, his presence reinforcing something without announcing it. And the clerk's hands trembled faintly now, her fingers pressing against the edge of the desk as she leaned forward just enough to see more clearly, her breath shallow, her mind racing through fragments of memory, faces, briefings, announcements she had only half paid attention to, and suddenly those fragments felt closer, sharper, as if they were about to lock into place, and the room, still unaware of the full picture, continued to shift in subtle ways. People straightening without knowing why, voices lowering even further, the ambient noise fading into something more focused, more contained, like a space preparing itself without instruction. And Angela reached the center aisle fully now, the thin line of light from the open door stretching toward her feet, catching along the edge of her coat, outlining her form in a way that felt almost intentional, though no one could have said why. And she paused there, not hesitating, not uncertain, simply allowing the moment to settle around her. And in that pause, something changed again, not in her, but in the way the room held her, the way attention gathered without being called, the way silence deepened without effort. And Daniel felt it press against him, that same quiet weight, his confidence no longer as automatic, his posture no longer as relaxed, his instincts telling him something was off even if he could not yet define it. And he glanced briefly toward the older man, searching for context, for confirmation, for anything that would restore the balance he thought he understood. But the older man did not look at him, did not acknowledge him at all, his focus remaining forward, aligned with Angela in a way that felt deliberate, and that absence of acknowledgement landed harder than any direct look could have. And the clerk's eyes widened just a fraction more, her lips parting as if she might speak, might say something, might interrupt the growing realization before it fully formed, but no words came, because something about the moment felt too precise to disrupt, too important to mishandle. And the judge's bench remained empty still, the seat waiting, the space prepared, and Angela's gaze lifted slightly toward it. Her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if she had always belonged in that direction, as if the room was only just catching up. And Daniel shifted again, this time more noticeably, his hand brushing lightly against his belt, a reflex he did not fully control, his eyes moving between her and the front of the room, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. And the silence stretched just a little longer, just enough to become something else, something that felt like the edge of a reveal, though no one had spoken it yet. And as Angela took one final step forward into the light, the room seemed to lean toward her without realizing it, waiting for what would come next. No one announced her name, and yet the space around Angela Brooks shifted as if it had been spoken out loud, the kind of quiet recognition that did not need sound to travel, only presence, only alignment. And she stood there in the narrow beam of light stretching from the open door, her figure outlined just enough to separate her from everything behind her, not elevated, not spotlighted, just defined, while the rest of the room remained slightly dimmer, slightly less certain. And the older man beside her lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, the kind that lived in institutions, in ranks, in systems that trained people to recognize authority without being told. And across the room, the clerk's breath caught softly, her eyes widening as the final piece slid into place, not with a dramatic realization, but with a quiet certainty that settled into her chest. And she straightened immediately, her posture correcting itself without instruction, her hands pulling back from the keyboard as if she had suddenly remembered where she was, and what this room meant, and who had just stepped into its center. And Daniel Hayes noticed that movement first, the clerk's sudden shift, the way her shoulders squared, the way her gaze fixed forward with a clarity that had not been there before, and it pulled his attention back to Angela again, but this time not with the same casual authority, not with the same easy dismissal, something in him hesitating. Not fully, not consciously, but enough to slow the certainty he had been carrying just moments ago, and he watched her more carefully now. The details he had ignored beginning to surface, the precision in her posture, the quiet confidence in the way she occupied space without asking for it, the absence of reaction where he expected resistance or compliance, and none of it fit the version of her he had already decided on, and that mismatch pressed against him in a way he did not like, because it did not resolve, it did not settle back into place. It only grew clearer the longer he looked, and Angela did not look back at him, not yet. Her attention still directed forward, toward the front of the courtroom, toward the empty bench that no longer felt empty in the same way, as if its purpose had already begun to shift before anyone physically took the seat. And a faint murmur rippled through the back rows, quickly suppressed, not out of instruction, but instinct, the kind of collective awareness that something important was unfolding without needing to be explained. And the older man finally moved again, stepping slightly to the side, creating a clearer path ahead of her, his gesture subtle but unmistakable, and the clerk rose halfway from her chair before catching herself, her movements suddenly too deliberate, too careful, as if every action now carried weight she had not accounted for before, and Daniel felt the room slipping just slightly out of alignment with him, the control he relied on no longer as absolute, his awareness sharpening as he tried to understand what had changed, what he had missed, what detail had been present the entire time without his noticing, and he glanced briefly toward the door, toward the light still cutting across the floor, then back to Angela, and for the first time, he did not see her as part of the background, not as someone passing through his authority, but as something else entirely, something he had not prepared for, and that realization did not arrive fully formed, it hovered at the edge of his thoughts, incomplete but persistent, like a word on the tip of his tongue that refused to come, and Angela took another step forward, her movement steady, unhurried, the sound of her shoes grounding the moment in something real, something undeniable, and as she moved, the room seemed to adjust around her, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, precise ways, shoulders straightening, eyes lifting, attention narrowing, and even the ambient noise seemed to soften, as if the building itself recognized the shift before the people inside it did, and Daniel's hand lowered from his belt, his posture tightening without him realizing it, his gaze following her path now with a focus that bordered on unease, because nothing about this felt familiar anymore, nothing fit the pattern he had relied on just minutes ago, and the clerk finally stood fully, her chair sliding back with a soft sound that echoed more than it should have, drawing a few more eyes toward the front. And those eyes did not return to their papers this time. They stayed, fixed on Angela, on the space she occupied, on the quiet authority that had not been announced but was becoming impossible to ignore, and the older man remained just behind her, his presence reinforcing the shift without adding to it, like a shadow that confirmed the shape of something already there. And Angela's gaze lifted slightly again, her expression calm, composed, untouched by the tension that had begun to ripple outward from her, as if she had stepped into this moment long before anyone else realized it was coming. And Daniel felt that distance now, not physical, but something deeper, the gap between what he thought he understood and what was unfolding in front of him. And he could not close it, not yet, not without something changing. And as Angela reached the space directly before the bench, the silence in the room settled into something complete, something waiting, and Daniel's breath slowed just slightly as the realization edged closer, still unspoken, still unfinished, but no longer avoidable. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into the room like something that had finally found where it belonged. And Angela Brooks stood at the front without claiming the space, without announcing herself. Her presence alone enough to shift the balance that had quietly governed every interaction before she stepped forward. And the older man behind her straightened fully now, his hands coming together lightly in front of him, his posture unmistakably formal, no longer blending into the background but aligning with something higher, something structured. And the clerk, still standing beside her desk, felt it fully then, the certainty locking into place in a way that left no room for doubt, her heart quickening not from fear but from recognition, from the awareness that she was witnessing a moment that would not need explanation later, because everyone who saw it would remember exactly how it felt. And Daniel Hayes felt that shift reach him too, not through words, not through commands, but through absence, the absence of normal cues, the absence of casual movement, the absence of the small noises that usually filled the space between authority and obedience. And he became aware of his own breathing, steady but heavier now, his chest rising just a little more than before, as if his body had begun to understand something his mind was still resisting. And he watched Angela more closely, his gaze narrowing not in judgment, but in focus, searching for something he had missed, something that would explain why the room no longer responded to him the way it had only minutes earlier. And Angela lowered her eyes briefly, not in submission, but in thought, a small, grounded pause that carried weight without effort. And when she lifted them again, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a quiet readiness that did not need to prove itself. And she reached out slightly, her hand brushing the edge of the wooden surface before her, her fingers resting there for a moment, feeling the texture, the coolness of it, as if reconnecting with something familiar rather than stepping into something new. And that simple gesture carried through the room in ways no one could articulate, because it was not about the action itself, it was about the ease of it, the naturalness, the way it suggested she had done this before, many times, in rooms like this, under lights like these, with eyes watching the same way they were watching now. And the older man shifted his weight subtly again, his stance reinforcing hers without overshadowing it. And the clerk's throat tightened as she realized she had been holding her breath, her lungs finally expanding as she exhaled slowly, carefully, not wanting to disturb the moment that had taken hold of everything around her. And Daniel's hand dropped fully to his side now, no longer resting near his belt, his posture adjusting without instruction, his shoulders pulling back just slightly, his stance narrowing as if he were recalibrating to something he could not yet define. And his eyes flicked briefly to the older man again, searching for confirmation, for hierarchy, for any signal that would restore the order he understood. But the older man's attention remained fixed forward, aligned with Angela in a way that left no ambiguity. And that absence of acknowledgement from him settled heavier than anything else, because it removed the last layer of certainty Daniel had been relying on. And the room held steady, no one speaking, no one moving beyond what was necessary. The atmosphere tightening not with tension, but with anticipation, as if something had reached the edge of being seen and was simply waiting to be named. And Angela's gaze moved across the room now, not quickly, not scanning, just a calm, deliberate awareness of the people present, her eyes passing over the clerk, the rows behind her, and finally landing, briefly, on Daniel. And that moment was quiet, almost too small to notice, but it carried a weight that did not need to be explained, because there was no reaction in her expression, no anger, no accusation, just recognition, clear and steady. And Daniel felt it. That look, not as a challenge, but as something else entirely, something that made his chest tighten again, something that made the moment earlier feel less settled than he had believed. And he held her gaze for just a fraction of a second before looking away, not intentionally, not as a decision, but because something in him could not hold it. Not yet, and the clerk saw that too, her eyes moving between them, understanding deepening without a single word being spoken. And Angela turned her attention forward again, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and the room seemed to align itself around that steadiness. The scattered energy from before now drawn into a single, quiet focus. And the older man took a half step closer, not beside her, not ahead of her, but positioned in a way that made his role unmistakable without needing explanation. And somewhere near the back, someone shifted again, the sound soft but noticeable, a reminder that the room was still filled with people trying to understand what they were witnessing. And Daniel stood there, still, his mind catching up in fragments, in pieces that refused to settle into a single, clear thought. And as Angela's hand remained lightly against the wood, her presence grounded, the silence stretched just long enough to feel complete, as if the moment had finally arrived where it needed to be, and all that remained was for someone to speak. The first voice did not come from the bench. It came from just behind her, measured and clear, carrying across the room without needing to rise. And it shifted something instantly, like a key turning in a lock no one had realized was there. And the older man spoke with a calm precision that did not invite interruption. "We are ready when you are." And the words were simple, almost ordinary, but the way they were delivered, the way they landed, changed the air in a way no announcement could have. And Angela Brooks did not respond immediately. She did not rush to fill the space. She allowed the words to settle, to be heard, to be understood in their own time, her hand still resting lightly against the wood, her posture steady, her gaze forward. And in that pause, the clerk felt it fully, the confirmation she had been circling finally arriving without fanfare, her shoulders straightening even more, her chin lifting slightly, her attention sharpening into something precise and respectful. And across the room, Daniel Hayes felt it too, not as clarity, not yet, but as pressure, the kind that builds when something you have assumed begins to unravel quietly, thread by thread. And he shifted his weight again, more noticeably now, his stance no longer relaxed, his eyes moving between Angela and the older man, trying to align what he was seeing with what he believed, and it did not fit, not cleanly, not comfortably. And the room responded in subtle waves, a man in the second row, sitting up straighter, a woman near the back lowering her phone without looking at it again, the ambient noise fading even further until the only sounds left were small, controlled, intentional. And Angela finally moved her hand from the wood, not pulling away quickly, just lifting it gently, as if concluding a thought that had already been completed, and she turned slightly, not fully toward the room, just enough to acknowledge its presence, her eyes passing over the people gathered there with a calm awareness that did not linger on any one person for too long. And when her gaze reached Daniel, it did not stop, it did not challenge, it simply included him in the same quiet recognition she had given the rest. And that, more than anything, unsettled him, because it removed the distinction he had relied on, the distance he had assumed, and for a moment, he felt exposed in a way he could not explain, not because anyone had said anything, but because something in the room no longer supported the version of events he had constructed. And the clerk took a slow breath, steadying herself, her hands now resting at her sides instead of on the desk, her posture fully aligned with the shift that had taken place. And the older man stepped slightly to the side again, creating a clear line of sight between Angela and the bench, his role now unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And Angela turned back toward the front, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if she had done this countless times before, as if this space had always been familiar to her, and the light from the door no longer defined her. It simply followed her, a faint outline that moved with her as she positioned herself exactly where she needed to be, not an inch off, not a step too far. And the room adjusted again, the collective awareness sharpening into something close to understanding, though no one had spoken it aloud yet. And Daniel's breath slowed, his chest rising and falling more deliberately now, his mind catching up in fragments, each piece landing heavier than the last. And he glanced once more at the older man, searching for confirmation, for context, for anything that would restore the structure he had relied on. But there was none offered, only that same quiet alignment, that same unspoken acknowledgement that placed Angela at the center of something he had not seen coming. And the silence held, complete, waiting, and Angela's gaze lifted slightly toward the bench, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And for the first time since she entered the room, it felt as though everything had reached its intended place, every movement, every glance, every pause aligning into a single, quiet moment of truth. And Daniel stood there within it, no longer certain of where he fit, no longer certain of what came next. And as Angela drew in a calm, measured breath. The room seemed to follow her without realizing it, as if her rhythm had become its own. No one gave a command to begin, and yet the room shifted into readiness. As if one had been spoken, the kind of silent coordination that only happens when people recognize authority without needing to hear it named, and Angela Brooks stepped forward the final inch, aligning herself with the bench in a way that felt practiced, precise, her shoulders relaxed but grounded, her presence neither heavy nor light, simply exact, and the older man moved to her side, but slightly behind again, his position reinforcing what the room was beginning to understand, his gaze forward, his posture formal, his role no longer ambiguous to those paying attention. And the clerk stood fully upright now, her hands at her sides, her eyes fixed on Angela with a focus that bordered on reverence, the last traces of uncertainty gone from her expression, replaced by something clear and steady, and across the room, a low rustle faded completely. People settling into stillness as if they had collectively decided not to miss what was coming next, and Daniel Hayes felt that stillness press in around him, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with a quiet inevitability that made it impossible to ignore, and he became aware of how he was standing, of where his hands rested, of the angle of his shoulders, small details he had never questioned before now feeling exposed in a way that made him subtly adjust, pulling his stance tighter, straighter, his gaze no longer drifting but fixed, attentive, searching, and Angela drew a slow breath, not dramatic, not emphasized, just enough to anchor the moment, and when she spoke, her voice did not rise above the room. It settled into it, clear, calm, carrying without effort. "Let us begin." And the words were simple, but the tone carried something unmistakable, something that did not ask for permission, something that assumed alignment, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not visible in any dramatic way, but present in the way people responded. The clerk moving quickly but quietly to adjust papers, a man in the second row, sitting even straighter, a subtle shift of attention that rippled outward without breaking the calm. And Daniel felt it most in what did not happen. No one looked to him for direction. No one waited for his cue. The flow of the room no longer passing through him the way it had earlier, and that absence landed heavier than any correction could have, because it left him standing within a structure that no longer centered him. And he watched Angela as she continued, her movements minimal, controlled, her hands resting lightly before her, her gaze steady as it moved across the room with quiet awareness. And there was no hesitation in her, no adjustment period, no moment of transition, only continuity, as if she had always been here, as if the room had only just caught up to that fact. And the older man remained still beside her, his presence a quiet confirmation, rather than a source of attention. And the clerk followed Angela's rhythm now, her actions aligning naturally, her movements precise, no longer uncertain or reactive, and Daniel's mind worked through it piece by piece, the fragments finally beginning to connect, the tone, the posture, the alignment of others, the way the room had shifted without instruction, and something in his chest tightened as the realization edged closer, not fully formed, but no longer distant, and he glanced once more at the older man, then back to Angela, and this time he did not look away as quickly, his gaze holding just a fraction longer, searching for something that would confirm or deny what he was beginning to understand, and Angela's eyes passed over him again, calm, steady, without judgment, without acknowledgement of the earlier moment, just recognition, simple and complete, and that lack of reaction unsettled him more than anything else, because it offered no resistance, no confrontation, nothing to push against or correct, only a quiet presence that made his previous certainty feel misplaced. And the room continued to move under her guidance, subtle, controlled, each action following the last with a rhythm that felt natural, unforced, and Daniel stood within it, no longer directing, no longer certain, his awareness sharpening with each passing second as the truth approached, and as Angela paused briefly between words, her gaze lifting slightly, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if it carried something just beneath the surface, waiting to be seen, and Daniel felt it then, the moment right before understanding becomes unavoidable, the edge of something that would change how he saw everything that had just happened, and he could not step away from it, not now. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, like light filling a room through a narrow gap, steady and impossible to stop, and Daniel Hayes felt it first in the way his own thoughts began to quiet. The usual confidence that guided his actions replaced by a careful attention he could not turn off, and he watched Angela Brooks as she continued, her voice even, her words measured, each one placed with intention, not to impress, not to assert, but simply because they belonged exactly where she put them, and the room responded in kind. Every movement aligned to her pace, every sound softened to match her tone, and for the first time since the morning began, Daniel was not anticipating what would happen next. He was listening, truly listening, his focus narrowing to the details he had ignored before, the cadence of her voice, the steadiness of her posture, the way no one interrupted her, not out of fear, but out of recognition, and that difference settled into him with a weight he could not dismiss, because it meant everything he had assumed earlier had been built on something incomplete, something he had not taken the time to see. And the clerk moved quietly at her desk, organizing documents with a precision that mirrored Angela's rhythm, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a calm efficiency, her eyes lifting only when necessary, her attention grounded in the moment, and the older man remained still, his presence unchanged, reinforcing the structure without drawing attention to it. And Daniel's gaze shifted between them, connecting the pattern now, the alignment, the respect, that had been present from the moment the door opened, even if he had not recognized it then, and his chest tightened slightly as the final pieces came into focus, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just clear, undeniable, and he understood then that the room had not changed, it had revealed itself, and he had been the one out of place all along. And Angela paused briefly, her eyes lifting again, scanning the room with that same quiet awareness, and when her gaze passed over Daniel this time, it lingered for just a fraction longer, not as a confrontation, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement that carried no judgment, and that made it harder to hold on to the version of events he had been clinging to, because there was nothing in her expression to push against, nothing to defend himself from, only a calm presence that reflected the moment back to him without distortion, and he felt the weight of that reflection settle in, not as accusation, but as understanding, and his posture shifted again, more subtly now, his shoulders easing just enough to release the tension he had been holding without realizing it, and his gaze lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, as if he needed a moment to process what had already become clear. And the room continued under Angela's guidance, each word, each pause, each movement reinforcing the structure that had always been there, now fully visible, now impossible to ignore, and Daniel stood within it, no longer outside, no longer separate, but not yet fully aligned either, caught in the space between what he had been and what he was beginning to understand, and the clerk glanced toward him for just a moment, her expression neutral but aware, as if she too recognized the shift taking place, not just in the room, but in him, and then she returned her focus forward, her role clear, her action steady, and Angela continued, her voice unwavering, her presence constant, the center of a room that now moved with her rather than around her, and Daniel felt the last of his certainty dissolve, not abruptly, not painfully, but completely, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. And as that understanding settled into place, he realized there was no way to return to the version of the moment he had believed in before, and that realization stayed with him as the room moved forward. The room no longer questioned her presence. It moved within it, each person settling into their place with a quiet certainty that had not been there before, and Angela Brooks continued with the same measured calm, her voice steady, her words precise, guiding the flow without force, without hesitation, and Daniel Hayes stood at the edge of that structure, no longer outside it, but not fully within it either. His awareness sharpened to every detail he had once overlooked, the rhythm of her speech, the way the clerk responded before being asked, the subtle alignment of the older man just behind her, all of it forming a pattern that now felt undeniable, and the weight of that pattern pressed into him, not harshly, not suddenly, but with a quiet persistence that made it impossible to ignore, and he felt his posture shift again, this time not out of instinct, but intention, his shoulders pulling back, his stance narrowing, his hands resting at his sides in a way that felt more deliberate, more aware, and he realized that he was no longer reacting to the room. He was adjusting to it, adjusting to her. And that recognition carried something deeper than discomfort. It carried consequence. And his gaze moved toward Angela once more, not searching now, not questioning, but acknowledging, seeing her not as he had before, but as she was, fully, clearly. And that clarity settled into him with a quiet finality. And the earlier moment, the one he had dismissed so easily, returned to him, not as a single event, but as a contrast, a reflection of how incomplete his understanding had been, and he felt it then, not as regret yet, not fully formed, but as a shift in perspective that he could not undo. And Angela paused briefly, her eyes moving across the room, taking in the alignment, the readiness, the quiet attention that had replaced the earlier tension, and she did not linger on Daniel. But she did not avoid him either, her gaze including him in the same calm awareness she extended to everyone else. And that inclusion carried weight, because it did not single him out, it did not isolate him. It simply placed him within the same structure he had once believed he controlled, and the clerk continued her work with steady precision, her movements smooth, her focus clear, no longer uncertain, no longer searching. And the older man remained still, his presence unchanged, reinforcing the order that had settled over the room. And Daniel felt that order now, not as something external, but as something he was beginning to understand from within, and his breath slowed, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the calm around him. And for a moment, everything felt aligned, every detail in place, every movement intentional. And then Angela spoke again, her voice carrying the same quiet authority. But this time there was something else within it, something that shifted the focus just slightly, not away from the room, but deeper into it. And Daniel felt that shift immediately, his attention narrowing, his awareness sharpening, because whatever came next would not simply continue what had already been established, it would test it, it would reveal whether the understanding that had settled into him would hold under pressure. And he straightened just a fraction more, his posture now fully intentional, his gaze steady, ready in a way he had not been before, and the room seemed to hold that same readiness, the silence no longer waiting, but poised, balanced on the edge of something that had not yet been spoken. And Angela's eyes lifted slightly, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if she already knew what would follow. And Daniel felt that again, the sense that she was not reacting to the moment, she was guiding it, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty. And as the next words began to form, the room leaned into them without realizing it. Angela Brooks did not raise her voice, she did not change her tone, and yet when she spoke again, the room felt it differently, as if the weight of her words had shifted from guiding to revealing, and she paused just long enough to let that transition settle, her eyes moving once more across the room before resting, not directly on Daniel Hayes, but close enough that the space between them carried meaning. And then she said, calm and clear, "Before we proceed, I want to address something that happened earlier." And the words did not echo, they did not strike sharply, but they landed with a precision that tightened the air, and Daniel felt it immediately, not as fear, not as panic, but as a stillness that locked his attention in place, his breath slowing, his posture holding, every instinct telling him that this moment was no longer about procedure. And the clerk's hands paused mid-motion, a single page held between her fingers, her eyes lifting without hesitation, her focus narrowing completely. And the older man beside Angela remained still, his presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a grounding, as if reinforcing the importance of what was about to unfold. And the room followed that shift, the quiet deepening, every movement halting just enough to create space for what had been spoken. And Daniel's mind moved quickly now, not in confusion, but in recognition. The earlier moment returning with clarity, not distorted, not softened, exactly as it had been, and he felt the weight of it differently now, not as something small, not as something routine, but as something incomplete, something he had not fully seen when it happened. And Angela did not rush to fill the silence that followed her words. She allowed it to exist, to settle, to reach every corner of the room. And then she continued, her voice steady, unchanged. "We are all responsible for how we carry authority, And the statement was simple, almost understated, but it carried a depth that extended beyond the moment, beyond the room. And Daniel felt it land in a place he could not deflect, because it was not directed at him alone. It was not an accusation. It was a truth presented without force, without judgment, and that made it harder to resist, and he felt his shoulders ease slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just present, and Angela's gaze moved again, this time settling on him fully, not briefly, not in passing, but with a calm steadiness that did not demand a response. And in that gaze, there was no anger, no expectation, only clarity. And Daniel met it, not with the same certainty he had carried before, but with something quieter, something more deliberate. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow to that space between them, not isolating them, but focusing on the exchange that was taking place without words. And the clerk felt it too, her breath held, her attention fixed, understanding that this was not confrontation, it was something else entirely, something more controlled, more intentional. And Angela did not hold the moment longer than necessary. She allowed it to exist just long enough to be felt, and then she shifted her gaze back to the room, continuing as if nothing had broken, as if everything was exactly as it should be. And that choice carried its own weight, because it did not isolate Daniel, it did not single him out, it placed him within the same standard she had just spoken, and the room responded in kind, the tension easing, not disappearing, but settling into something more balanced, more grounded. And Daniel felt that shift within himself as well. The earlier uncertainty now shaped into something clearer, something he could not ignore or dismiss. And he stood there, no longer questioning what had happened, no longer searching for explanations, but understanding that the moment had not been taken from him. It had been shown to him. And that realization stayed with him as Angela continued, her voice steady, her presence unchanged, guiding the room forward without losing what had just been acknowledged. And as the flow resumed, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, not waiting, but resolved in a way that left no space for denial. The room did not return to what it had been. It moved forward from what it had understood, carrying the weight of Angela Brooks's words not as tension, but as alignment. And she continued with the same steady presence, her voice guiding without pressing, her tone unchanged as if what had just been acknowledged was not an interruption but part of the structure itself. And Daniel Hayes stood within that structure now, not resisting it, not questioning it, but adjusting to it in real time, his awareness no longer searching outward but settling inward. And he felt the difference in how he held himself, the subtle release in his shoulders, the steadiness in his breath, the way his gaze no longer drifted but remained focused, attentive. And he understood then that authority was not something he projected, it was something he carried, and that realization did not come with ease, but it came with clarity. And Angela moved through the proceedings with quiet precision, each word placed exactly where it needed to be, each pause intentional, allowing the room to follow without confusion. And the clerk matched that rhythm seamlessly now, her earlier uncertainty replaced by a calm efficiency that reflected the order that had settled over everything. And the older man remained still, his presence unchanged, a constant reinforcement of the structure that no longer needed explanation. And Daniel watched all of it, not as an outsider, but as someone learning to see what had always been there. And the earlier moment no longer sat in his mind as something isolated. It connected to everything he was witnessing now, forming a contrast that sharpened his understanding. And he did not look away from it. He did not push it aside. He allowed it to exist fully, because he knew now that ignoring it would only return him to the version of himself that no longer fit the room. And Angela's gaze moved across the space again, not searching, not assessing, simply aware. And when it passed over Daniel, there was a subtle shift, not in her expression, but in the way the moment held, as if offering him a choice without stating it. And he felt that, the quiet invitation to respond, not with words, not with defense, but with presence. And he straightened slightly, not in reaction, but in intention, his posture aligning more naturally with the room, his focus clear, and for the first time since the morning began, he felt grounded, not in control, but in understanding. And that difference settled into him with a quiet certainty. And the room continued to move, each action following the next with a calm continuity that no longer needed to prove itself. And Angela did not linger on what had been addressed. She did not return to it. She allowed it to remain where it belonged, acknowledged, integrated, and then carried forward. And that choice shaped the atmosphere more than anything she could have said, because it demonstrated something the room could feel but not articulate, that authority did not need to hold on to. Correction to be effective, it only needed to be consistent. And Daniel understood that now, not as a concept, but as something lived in the moment, and his gaze lifted again, steady, meeting the space ahead of him without hesitation, and the clerk moved another document into place, her action smooth, her attention unwavering, and the older man shifted slightly, his stance relaxed but still aligned, and the room felt complete, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had found its place within it. And Angela's voice carried through once more, calm and grounded, guiding the next step without effort. And Daniel followed that rhythm naturally, no longer out of habit, but out of understanding. And as the moment settled fully into itself, there was no need for anything more to be said, no need for emphasis or reinforcement, because the change had already taken root, and it showed in the smallest details, in the way people held themselves, in the way they listened, in the way they moved. And Daniel felt that change within himself as clearly as he saw it around him. And he knew that the moment earlier would not be erased. It would remain, not as something to hide, but as something that had led him here, to this understanding, to this alignment, to this quiet shift that no one had forced but everyone could feel. And as Angela paused briefly, her presence steady, her gaze forward, the room did not wait, it followed. Nothing needed to be declared at the end, because the room already understood what had changed, and Angela Brooks allowed the final moments to settle without forcing them into words, her presence steady, her posture unchanged, as the last pieces of the proceedings moved into place with quiet precision. And when she finished speaking, she did not linger, she did not look around for acknowledgement. She simply paused, a brief, grounded stillness that marked completion without announcing it, and the room responded in kind, not with noise, not with movement, but with a shared understanding that something more than routine had just occurred, something that would remain long after the chairs were empty and the lights dimmed. And the clerk lowered her hands slowly, her work complete, her posture still aligned, her eyes lifting once more toward Angela with a quiet respect that no longer questioned itself. And the older man stepped back just slightly, his role fulfilled, his presence easing into the background without breaking the structure he had helped reinforce. And Daniel Hayes stood where he had been, but not as he had been, the difference subtle from the outside, but undeniable within him, his shoulders no longer carrying the same weight, his breath steady in a way that felt earned rather than assumed. And he watched Angela as she stepped away from the bench, her movements as calm and deliberate as they had been from the moment she entered, no change in pace, no shift in tone, only continuity. And as she passed him, she did not stop, she did not turn fully toward him, but there was a moment, brief and precise, where her presence aligned with his again, close enough to be felt. And in that moment, there was no tension, no unfinished conflict, only a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. And Daniel felt it clearly, not as forgiveness, not as judgment, but as something simpler, something stronger, recognition. And he held that moment without trying to shape it, without trying to respond too quickly, allowing it to exist exactly as it was. And when she moved past him, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt resolved, and he turned slightly, not out of habit, but intention, his gaze following her for just a second longer before returning forward. And the room began to shift again, not back to what it had been, but into something quieter, something steadier, people gathering their things with a calm that mirrored what had just taken place. Conversations remaining low, measured, as if everyone understood that raising their voices would break something they had not yet fully named. And the clerk sat down again, her movements careful but no longer uncertain, her attention returning to her work with a clarity that carried forward. And the older man moved toward the door, his steps unhurried, his posture relaxed now that the moment had passed. And Daniel remained still for a second longer, allowing everything to settle within him. The earlier version of himself no longer fitting the space he occupied, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate, and he glanced down briefly, his hands at his sides, steady, grounded, before lifting his gaze again, his posture aligned. Not out of habit, but understanding, and as he turned toward the aisle, the light from the open door stretched across the floor once more, softer now, less defined, and he stepped into it without hesitation, his movement calm, unforced, and the room behind him continued to settle, each person carrying a piece of the moment in their own way, and Angela moved ahead without looking back, her presence unchanged, her pace steady, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and perhaps that was what made it stay, not the volume of the moment, but its quiet, the way it had reshaped everything without needing to prove itself, and Daniel walked forward with that understanding, not fully formed, but real, something he would carry beyond the walls of the courtroom, beyond the routines he thought he knew. And as the door began to close behind them, the light narrowed slowly, the space returning to stillness. But not the same stillness it had held before. Something had shifted within it. Something that would remain long after the moment had passed. And Daniel felt that shift settle into him as he stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the doors soft behind him. And for the first time, he did not rush to move on. He let the moment stay with him just a little longer, because he knew it would not leave.